incredible space and welcome, and thank you to the Upton Cultural Council for funding this presentation. My name is Sarah Guerin, and I say my name because my dad is from France, and it's a very common French last name. So, but Guerin is fine here. I am a cowboy boot maker and an artist, and I grew up in Lynn and in Swampscott, Massachusetts, which were footwear making hubs, and I never knew there was any shoemaking there until I was an adult. It is so divorced and depleted and gone from that area that this is a tragedy that I aim to heal all the time with my practice. So I call myself an artist and a boot maker because I have a multi-pronged creative practice. So I will let you know what to expect for tonight's presentation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I call this presentation 10 Footers History and Living Tradition through my story. And we'll talk about the 10 footers and why the Upton 10 footer is important and falls into this story that I am piecing together over the course of my career. And my career and my life are just totally enmeshed. And this is how I go through my days, boot making, researching history, and talking to people. And then I'm going to do a kind of explanatory boot making demonstration on how a boot goes together, the steps of that. And then I invite you to ask questions and really come up and look at all the pieces that I have displayed up here, because you will be able to look at them with a more informed eye after you hear what I have to say. And if you have any questions as we go along that you really need to know at that time, and please do. Please talk to people. It's my favorite part. It really just informs the discourse between us. Like what you have to share with me is this value. So, get started. I call my presentation 10 Footers, History and Living Traditions, because what I do is a living tradition. I am a boot maker, but I am not a historical reenacting boot maker. I make boots by hand from raw materials using the techniques that are called Western side seam construction, which is more commonly known as a cowboy boot. And I do that as an active contemporary artisan practice. So I am not trying to replicate how something was done in, say, 1810 or 1820. There are shoemakers who do that, and we have overlapping interests, and we help each other out by sharing information. But that's not what I do. That said, I am pretty much making a boot how it was made in 1875. The thing that I don't do, ironically, is stitch my soles with a big machine, which is how the very first cowboy boots were done, because we already had big stitching machines at that point that type of footwear was developed. So it's a little bit ironic because I do that by hand, and I do it because it's a living tradition. I like doing it, and I can do whatever I want. So I do this in a replica 10 footer. So a 10 footer were the vernacular, so Massachusetts specific, and then it spread out a little bit into New Hampshire and Connecticut. They were specific miniature shoemaking factory. It was the common standard shoemaking space from 1810 to 1860 is the heyday, but there were some of them late 1700s, and there were a couple hangers-on who kept doing it up as late as 1890 or so. And those little buildings were called 10 footers because they were generally 10 by 10, but they came in kind of every shape and size that was kind of close to that. Some are 11 by 14, some are 12 by 12, but they were called 10 footers, and they were all over the place in Massachusetts. So each town had probably 200 to 250 of these little buildings, and they were part of a really sophisticated assembly line type production system of making shoes. And this is in 1810, 1820, and we don't really know that anymore, right? Like when I saw a boot shop, like the boot shop you have here, or I grew up around Lynn and Swampscott, so I saw the Lynn 10 footer at the Lynn Museum. I thought a shoemaker had this workshop in his yard or in the town common or something, that he maybe had 2 or 3 guys working for him, that they knew how to make a shoe from beginning to end, and that this was tragic. Like here I am in the turn of the century, 1900s to 2000s, desperately want to be a shoemaker, can't learn this knowledge, and nobody knows how to make a shoe from beginning to end anymore. This trying to figure out like how my workshop could support this knowledge system that was so difficult to get is how I ended up researching 10 footers, and it's been a weekly obsessive practice of mine since about 2017. So the Upton 10-footer is 1788, and this little building is a workshop that did not have a single shoemaker working in it. My research, and we have so much in our archives that tells us exactly how these buildings were used and the knowledge that's been lived in them. This was where men worked doing the final process of bootmaking and shoemaking. So a shoe or a boot is an incredibly complex object. You know, we all wear them wherever there are humans on the planet. There is footwear, so this is not like we are the center of the universe of shoemaking. But what happened in Massachusetts is actually quite important globally because we happened to be the place that had this sophisticated hand system. So while people were making shoes by hand all over the world at the time, the greater Boston area was a draw to immigration to shoemakers. So we had shoemakers from Italy and England and Germany flocking here because there was work here and there was a system of work. So they were coming here, and then we hit that moment of industrialization, mechanization, where we stopped doing each process by hand as human innovation would say, how can I speed this up? How can I do this faster? How can I do this more efficiently? How can I save my hands to do this? And we had, because we had so many shoemakers here, we happened to be the place where we made those jumps. So most of the machines that became patented, mechanized production happened around Boston, and then spread out to the rest of the world. So we are this really important space in time. And what I care about is how that jump completely wiped itself out, right? But by 1990s, we don't really have any kind of solid, stable shoemaking system here anymore. Whereas in other places where, yes, industrialization devastated economies and we shipped a lot of footwear making and everything making off to other places, to Asia, to India, to South America, it didn't quite devastate it as much as it did here. And so I really talk about how these spaces were used. I investigate how they were used. I look into their stories. I walk through the buildings like I did with Linda, looking at all the architectural elements in order to understand these things. So, back to my story. I wanted to be a shoemaker when I was a teenager. It is this wildly inconvenient calling, and every one of us who does it, and I'm sure we have another shoemaker here who can attest to this, every one of us who dedicates our life to it has the same story. I have to do it, I have to do this thing. There's no clear path to it. There are no schools anymore to learn how to make a shoe by hand. There are no real clear paths at all. Okay, there's no schools, but how do you learn how to do that? When I say I'm a cowboy maker and I'm from Massachusetts, people inevitably say, well, that's really weird. Why? Cowboys have nothing to do with Massachusetts. I have a double weirdness. My dad is from Paris, and I grew up in Massachusetts, so between those two things, I had zero relationship with cowboy boots as a cultural object. But they were absolutely an intimately tied together, the legacy of cowboy boot making, and the connections I've made through research in Massachusetts footwear making history. And this boot shop, as I walk through, this is my life. I'm constantly researching, revising, adding pieces of puzzles, dropping in place. And this shop answered a couple of little questions along the way. Thank you for helping with this, for preserving this. So, this is inside of the 10-footer here. So while it was a boot shop in 1788, at a certain point, it started being used by a blacksmith. Right? So the windows, these horizontal windows, are not typical to a 10-footer. Tall vertical windows were, because when these spaces were used by 8 men working in here, they needed natural light. So the real estate next to the window was prime real estate. We have so many shoemaker diaries and journals and accounts that talk about what it was like to work in these spaces. And if you were the low shoemaker on the social hierarchy, you were in the dark corner sitting over there. As I said, this was not a single shoemaker shop. This was probably 8 men, 6 to 8 men working in this little space. And the reason they did that is because they worked really differently than how we think we work today. There was no work table. There was no bench. This was the shoemaker's bench. It's called a shoemaker's bench, and it's called a seat or a berth. And they're low to the ground, so that when you're sitting on them, your lap is horizontal to the ground, and this is your work table. So 8 guys would work in a space like that because they sat all day long, they never got up, and they just made their shoes on the lap. And you had all your tools to the right of you if you were righty, and you would have a lefty shoemaker bench if you were lefty. So we find these shoemaker benches that have left curved rasps and all kinds of, supporting documentation of how this space was used. And as we started innovating and making small-scale tools at first to speed up these processes, the work habits changed. Right now, if you had a bench tool that you could crank to cut through really thick leather, instead of doing this by hand on your lap, then you needed a bench to put it on. So we started, now only 4 guys are working in here, or 2 guys, because we have bigger benches and bigger machines. Yes?
Do you have a bench or a table?
Do what?
Do you have a bench or a table?
I have, right now in my setup, I have both. Okay. But in my 10-footer at home that I usually work in, I only have benches and I stand. I'm really tall, I don't like to hunch over. I want to preserve my posture, and so I actually have an elevated Julia Child work table, so this high. And I had an apprentice that was 5 feet tall, and I had to make her a little bit like step stools to everybody. But so in this 10-footer, this is the Upton 10-footer. Here, all of this, I believe the windows were changed in order to accommodate in the work that the blacksmith was doing. And this whole chimney fireplace forge was added. This, however, tells me that this was a 10-footer that shoemakers were using. So even if you didn't have that shop sign on there, if I went into this building, I can recognize this wooden beadboard along the bottom. It's wooden because that low bench is next to it, and they stuck all kinds of little nails in there to hang on the tools too as well, so that you could have it on your bench next to you, but also hang up. This little structure here was supporting a chimney up above. It had the pot and stones that went into it. And of course, in 2025, I would just naturally assume that this pot and stone was a heated space, except that we have hundreds of accounts from shoemakers saying that pot and stone was a working tool, wasn't a heated space. That tool kept wax for shoemaking tempered at the right temperature. And it would keep the irons. So we have all kinds of tools. This is an actual 1800s iron that I use in my shoemaking now. And these metal ends, have to be kept at a certain, not too hot temperature in order to do the work with the wax that they're doing. And the irons would be all over that pot belly stove. And water, where it's water when we work with leather. And so in the winter, that water would freeze often, and I would keep the pot belly stove kept the water next to the stove from freezing. That said, the shoemakers were freezing most of the time, because if you had a roaring fire going in there, your wax wasn't at the right temperature, your irons were too hot. So if you look, this is me peeking my head into the attic, which is called the prop loft, and this is where they stored all of the really heavy, big pieces of leather, because they take up space, and they didn't have space in there. If you look up in there, there's the chimney of the blacksmith, and here's the little stump of a chimney left over from that pot belly stove. So all of these architectural elements are telling this story about shoemaking. So when I was 18 and wanted to be a shoemaker and couldn't figure out what to do, I went to art school, and I was an architecture major. So this has really informed how my relationship with architecture of space, of architecture of workspace, of using these, like, how does architecture support or harm craft knowledge? And my senior degree project, whereas most people design building in an architecture program, my degree project was about the obsolescence of skilled craftspeople in contemporary society. It was about masons who have this type of knowledge, who have specialized tools, who used to build buildings like this, and knew how to do it with integrity, being relatively obsolete in a culture that is now building facade-type curtain wall veneers. And 20 years later, I was just anecdotally telling somebody this story, and I said, my God, I became that person that I was telling this story about. But it's been an enriching life. So this is at the Mid Museum's 10-footer, where they use, there's the pop-up and so mock-up, and they use these kind of plaster cast people to show how that space was used. And here, this is the Upton 10-footer, and it's pretty dark, but there's this ladder going flat up against the wall to save space to get to that pop-off, which was also the super typical architectural element of the 10-footers. so that helps identify. And this would have been a vertical window across the line. So why did these things matter? They matter because they tell how the space was used. They relate to the type of knowledge that was used at this time. But because we've moved so far away from it, and there aren't a whole lot of people digging through historical society archives and library basements, pulling these journals and stories out, they really show, they give the foundation on how that art of production changed and why it's obsolete and why something has to be issued now with that knowledge. How can we, my goal is to really shift our systems, to take all of this, to take my bookmaking practice, to take investigations into architecture, to talk to people who've lived in towns for generations and know the use of these buildings, or know a story or something that could be a critical piece of the puzzle, in order to make better systems. Like, I wanted my 10-footer shoe shop in my backyard to support my craft, and it did, but it wasn't supporting it in the way that I thought it used to be. But now I use that to rewrite something new. So I rewrote an art and crafts zoning bylaw that now allows freestanding structures for artists and craftspeople that were not permitted by zoning language before. And our zoning language tells our values and helps support the art system. So all of these things have to work together in order to make better spaces now. So this is the Stone Historic that's outside of here. And they chose to interpret it, so interpretation versus use. They interpret it as an old space, like this is the way the space would be. Probably 1860-ish when we started getting bigger tools, so this big roller here is a roll leather and kind of squish it and compress the fibers. I haven't seen, I've seen many, many drawings or catalogs of them. I've never seen an actual one besides this, but they let me use it, which is really great. And this is one direction to go. And I'm just saying that because you have invested so much in preserving your 10-footer. And one direction is to fill in gold tools and say this is how it was and this is an important thing to do. I believe you have an example of how that space actually can support contemporary artisans, right? We had a blacksmith working in there who adapted that space and used that building in a way that supported that craft for a while. And at every moment in time, right now, we have people like me, people like Lisa, who need workspaces and are generally working in a basement or backyard and not very visible. And one of the best things about 10-footers was the accessibility of their architecture, right? They were 1 or 2 steps off the ground. They were on a street that people pass. So when you walk by, you got to look in the window and see what was going on there. The architecture connected you to this. This is the Van building in Lynn, which is now apartments, but didn't burn down in a big fire here. We went from making shoes in this space to making shoes in this space within 15 years. The technology of architecture. And what got lost when we moved into this space was that public connection to walking by. Unless you work in the shoe industry, you're not going to see any of what's going on. You know, many things are gained, and I do want to give everybody a disclaimer that I'm not judgmental. I say things that sometimes come off as judgmental, but really I'm analytical. I just want to know everything and why it is the way it is in order to talk about better systems, how we might shift things to better systems. Let me go back one. I'm currently the public artist in residence in Salem, Massachusetts, and they have these little buildings that are very similar to 10-footers. And my proposal for that project, it's called 10-footer Institute, was to turn that studio space into an active artisanal movemaking space in order to talk about all these things with the public. So to me, the engagement with the public and that reconnection of space, workspace, the architecture of it, to people just walking by is critical. Because when we do this in museums, you're already like bringing out people because it's only people that come to museums that hear what you have to say. And I really firmly believe that like, the more uncurated people I hear what it's like to be a bootmaker in 2025, the better it is for our future systems and the things we produce. So I haven't really even talked about the qualities of the things that I produce or that I produce in these factories. What was great about mass production was that shoes became more affordable. They became more accessible. We mass produce, in this system, 10,000 pair of shoes for 5 people a year. And this is all done by hand. So this wasn't like we were not producing big numbers of things. That went from 50 lasted pair of shoes a day to 700 lasted pair of shoes a day when we made the jump in technology, architecture, and tools. So inevitably, making that much more shoes, they were going to be more affordable. But we still mass-produced shoes that were designed with intent to repair up until the 1970s, 1980s. We really shifted toward mass-producing shoes globally, designed to fall apart by their construction and by their materials, and that's what's going to be so precarious in our system. So when we have this huge, amazing, sophisticated system here, what is getting left out of this story by the focus on influencers, by all the pictures of the nice little display that put together up there, and look at it when you leave. If you look at it already, look at it again when you leave. It has drawings and representations of the shoemakers working in the shop. What's left out of this is 2/3 of the shoemaking process that has been quite invisible, and it's because women did it. So when you make a shoe, or boots, there are 4 primary categories of that process. The first is pattern making. The second is called clicking, and that's cutting the pieces, the pattern pieces that are going to go in together into making the shoe out of the raw material, out of leather or fabric. And then closing is sewing it all together. Back in handmaking time, that was called binding, but sewing it all together. And then the final process is called making. Making is a technical term in footwear. And everything up until making was done by women and is still done by women on machines for the most part. So women were doing that in the time of the headquarters in their homes. And it's really similar to making garments and dressmaking. And the very first machine to infiltrate shoe making was the sewing machine. And that was done in homes. And then if you think of kind of historic pictures of women working in shoes and footwear, it's still doing those processes in factories. Oh, this is my little dance story. I do like to interject stories. So that dance building, one of the things that as we as a culture became more and more divorced from shoemaking was that we lost the vocabulary to talk about too. So it's quite difficult. You can get a group of shoemakers together who start talking, and a layperson isn't going to understand a whole bunch of what they're saying because of the vocabulary. So, for instance, we think of cobblers as shoemakers and shoe repair people. In shoemaking world, cobblers only repair, and shoemakers and bootmakers make. We had a word called coordinator for that is completely gone from American language. British people still use it, but it's completely gone here. And we just say cobbler for makers, and that's not quite accurate. So this is called the vamp building, and it's still called the vamp building. And a vamp is the upper part of a woman's high heel shoe in this form, and this is an architect's joke because there's the plan of the vamp building, and it's designed to look like a vamp of a shoe. And, it's so far from it, in linen, one knows why it's called. But so here is the time of the 10-footer, when they were the first workers to go into the factory buildings. They were on the sewing machines, massive ones full of sewing machines, stitching the uppers, and then we're still doing all of the making, that technical term, which has many steps to it. So when you come up after, I've just listed them out. This is all the work that women were doing, and this is making. So making has as many steps to it. And it's really the bottoming of the shoe. It's taking this loose upper. Women would be doing everything in the bootmaking process, doing this, or a shoemaking process, to make it's called an upper. So it would be loose, and you could have sewn this on the sewing machine, you sew it by hand, and then they were selling these piecework to shoemakers. Or if they were married to somebody, they probably weren't selling it to their husband. But for the most part, women were making income selling uppers for decades and decades. And then a man would take that and turn it into a bigger shoe by stretching it around the last, which I'll talk about later. But this is the inside of a photograph of an active 10-footer from the 1860s. And this is where men were doing all the making, and you can see all those uppers hanging on pegs that they bought or were sold to them. So the way the system worked wasn't that single shoemaker working in the shop. It was like barber shops now for us. That's kind of the best equivalent we have when we rented a chair. Somebody owned the building and rented your space in there. more often than not, the shoemaker didn't own the building. They weren't wealthy enough. A widow owned the building, or a person, a man owned it as an investment and rented all those spaces. So we have so many stories that are just telling these facts, and these stories just are something that I discovered when I was trying to figure out our workspace, and I think that they're just incredibly important to bring to the forefront and say, like, how does that fit into the contemporary practice of somebody in 2025? This is the inside of my template in my backyard. So I have a template where I'm doing everything from beginning to end, from design through making in the same space. So this is why a single person working in that space uses it incredibly differently than it's used historically. And so this is my making section, which is really dirty and messy. And you can see my sewing machines back here, a little cleaner back there, and there's my big work table. It's right in the middle. I have this big workbench. And so my sewing machines and this finisher, it's a sanding machine right there, are the only electric machines that I use. They're part of the making tradition, and like I said, the food makers also use these big, massive stitching machines that I don't use as I do it right. I also care about where to learn. I could learn to be a shoemaker. So I went to architecture school, and I still kept looking for school, because we live in Massachusetts, which I think is a cultural place that tells you the way you learn things is to go to school. We don't live in a place where culturally it's typical to learn from another person and think of that as an education. So it never occurred to me that I could learn to be a shoemaker in any other way than I find in school. And that we just didn't have it anymore, so I had to find it somewhere else. Ironically, the last shoemaking school in the country closed in 1975, which was the year I was born in 76, so 75, 76 class. Right down the street from where I grew up, and that building still exists, and that is called the Independent Industrial Shoemaking School. It closed. I ended up going to Fort Waiters College in England after I went to architecture school. And I thought, that's it. I found the school, took out a big loan, I dragged these two toddlers over there. I went to the school, and it is a school for designers to know how factories make shoes so they can be better designers. We don't have shoemaking schools that are actually teaching shoemaking really anywhere anymore. You can find like workshops and still just individual shoemakers who shared their knowledge, transferred their knowledge through kind of one-on-one or one-on-one relationships. Here's my Twitter, and that's where I did that. So for a year and a half, the Mass Cultural Council funded a traditional arts apprenticeship program where they paid me and then paid all the materials and all the tools in order to learn shoemaking in that space. So in 1975, we were learning shoemaking here. 1810 and 2010, we were really learning it in that type of space. That last class, 1975, had a student named Brady Mello, and probably somebody in this room has Mello shoes on. He founded the Merrill Shoemaking Company with two guys from New Hampshire, and in 1986, he cashed out and sold left his name on the brand, and moved back to Utah, where he was from. He came to Lynn to go to this school. And in Utah, he opened up a little workshop where he was making cowboy boots and hiking boots by hand, because it's the awesomest thing in the world to do. And he was teaching small workshops to anybody who wanted to learn. He taught a Colorado bootmaker, now bootmaker, named Jim Covington, how to make boots. And Jim also learned from Edwin Martin, an Amarillo, Texas bootmaker, and Jim married a woman from Massachusetts and moved here. And when I came back from that shoemaking school, totally depressed because I hadn't learned anything other than how factories glue petroleum-based products together to make what we call shoes that fall apart within a year. The only person making any type of footwear from beginning to end, the way I wanted to make them, the way I thought things would make, was Jim Covington, who had moved to Guerin. And he's the one who trained me for 3 years in everything that I know about craft bootmaking. And he's remarkable bootmaker. I like to think of that knowledge set as the most valuable thing, right? Like when I look at tools, and I know how to use all these shoemaking tools, I go to museums, I go to historical societies, I identify those tools. I think of them as being held in trust for that knowledge set to be again, and it is. We are living in the golden age of shoe and boot makers right now for many factors that we don't have to find. But I think that this is a circle of knowledge. The knowledge that Randy Guerin went to Utah, to Colorado, to Texas, to Massachusetts, and they are in my hands, in my brain right now, and I grow it. And this is an important cycle. I teach them. I teach the Rhode Island School of Design. I teach boot making. I teach shoe making. I would love to teach apprentice again at some point, which is very different than teaching a class. But this is all the responsibility of the keeper of knowledge to continue this, to pass on what we know, to keep it alive. When I go into these archives, I find an affinity with the shoemakers of old. When I went through the West Newbury Historical Society's tool collection, I found in a tiny little drawer of this old stitching clamp apparatus, these needles tied up like this. These are my needles tied up like this. And I know exactly why they were kept that way. Because in this beautiful, long, sophisticated process, when you go to last the toe and you need an extra reinforcement so that when you're pulling the stitches, that this group gets sewn together, really heavy duty sewing. And when you're pulling at a pointy bit, it can rip the leather right through, so you need reinforcements. And the best reinforcements are your leftover bits. And the best way not to lose them is to keep the needles in there. And this is from 150 years ago. And this isn't something that Jim had taught me. This is this wonderful affinity. And I also, so I was in the Lynn Public Library, pulled out a 1775, 76 account book, started reading it, and it's mostly just like how much each sole cost, or how much each pair of shoes these guys are. And in the middle, there's this little handwritten note, and it's he was at the Battle of Concord. And when I went to the museum, they just handed me this book, and I read it, and I thought, my gosh, like, I live in a cowboy making world, but I'm in Massachusetts, so there's a lot of political, let's say, difference of opinion in that world. Yet every time all of the makers get together, we are so connected through our craft, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, where was Nathaniel Tarbox located? What was his town?
He was in Lynn, his
Oh, he
wife
was
was
in
from
Lynn.
Arbor, and she stitched uppers.
Okay.
When I was reading this, it got me thinking about the shoemakers of that time, right? Like there were loyalists and patriots, and the political strife of that time must have been just as great. And I wonder if these shoemakers and boot makers could transcend political division or cultural division by their craft the way that we can now. I think it's a good way to live, and it's a unique opportunity for that kind of transcendence of cultural divides. This is the United Shoe Machine Corps building in Beverly, Mass. So when we started making these bigger and bigger and bigger machines, this building was where most of them were made. Locally, we called it the shoe, like USMC. And I went there in 1997 as an architecture student and took these photos when it closed down and they were shipping the last machines off, mostly to South America there. And climbed in with my nerdy architecture students who took photos. I found this years later, where Sidney Winslow, who had founded USMC in 1899, had brought his dad's 10-footer over from Lynn and had him put it next to the building, and it happens to be the same space where I took my picture, which I think was like a little bit. Because this complex is huge. But this is the story of all of these interrelated parts, is the story of now. We have some version of this going on. Non-pig, this is another vocabulary that we've lost over time, that I help reconnect with the resources at hand in all these historical societies. So a non-pig sander is a sanding tool that is was used in shoemaking all across the board. It's now pretty much only used by cowboy makers. And it's this circular spindle sander that fits, this is a little technical, it fits on your bench or sanding wheels, and it points down. And because a cowboy boot has this really organically curved bottom with this tall heel that's in the way, you can fit that sander to sand these wooden pegs. And I'll talk about the wooden pegs in a little bit. But that sander is called a non-pig. All the boot makers have them. And all the boot makers that I met thought non-pig was a German word because there were a lot of German boot makers. And here are various versions encouragements from USMC over time as they developed. There's my own examiner right there on Mars. And there's a huge book called The Dictionary of Leatherworking Tools that most historical societies and museums use to identify their tools. And when I go through it with my Massachusetts eye, I have found a few things that are just wrong. And the non-peg buffer is named after Salem and where USMC was, which was called non-peg, was the indigenous name at the time. And none of the papers knew that. And I've sort of reconnected them with this origin story of that term, which is important in Massachusetts. So I am not a debater because I want to look back towards the past, even though so much of my practice is rooted in the past in Massachusetts. I want to debater because the techniques and history of bootmaking itself arms me with how I live my life right now. Because I write about this stuff, I collect it and teach, and then I sit in my shop alone for hours and hours and hours stitching and making things by leather. And that's how I process things through life. And these are some of the boots that I make. Now I'll tell you about the So boots and most of our shoes used to be all made with leather, right? We've moved away from that quite a bit and use most of our sneakers and boots and shoes now are made out of petroleum-based products and plastics. And they're called cemented construction. They're mostly glued together. And boots and shoes were made out of two primary types of leather. So leather's going to come from an animal, and after the animal dies, its skin is taken off, and we do tan it, and tanning stops the process. And tanneries and tanning have been incredibly tied to shoemaking. So wherever you had big shoemaking centers around the world, you would have tanneries there. So we have lots of tanneries in Massachusetts because we have lots of shoemaking in Massachusetts. And there's two, I can talk all day about leather and tanning, but there's two primary ways of doing it. One is called vegetable tanning, and that process is taking the hide, putting it in big pits of water with leaves and bark and acorns and things like that. And you change, it's called a tea, and you change that tea a few times, and it's long. It can be anywhere from 8 months up to 18 months in order to tan the leather. And that leather is going to have certain qualities. And for shoe and boot making, it's the structural part. So it's going to be the insole, which is the foundation of the boot or shoe. And an insole is not what we think of insoles where you slide an insert into your shoe. Shoemakers call that a sock liner. The insole is really the foundation, the thing really deep inside that you never get to see. And in the type of construction that cowmakers are, which all the shoes in Massachusetts pretty much were the same type of construction hundreds of years ago, we sew everything to the insole. So it's all held together. And this was a construction that was designed to repair. So from the very beginning, we are thinking that we're going to resole these shoes over and over again. And then we also use wooden pegs, or wooden nails, and I have some up here, that you would drive the layers of leather together. You would hold it with wooden pegs, which expand and contract at the same rate as the leather when it gets wet from rain or from the sweat inside your foot. So we solved these problems really well early on and then moved away from them. But I want to show you this veg tan leather. You can pass it around. One over here.
Well, this has been happening locally, or
Yep.
it might have been
Yep.
a supplier.
So you can see that it's almost like wood, right? Like a lot of times people think stacked heels are wood, that it's really hard and it's really stiff. And when I said we use a lot of water in shoe and boot making, we use a lot of water. We are constantly plunging our work into water throughout the many months it takes to make them, which is sort of the opposite of what you think with your shoes. You're always trying not to get them wet. But that's because we don't wear shoes fully with leather anymore. And that really would just get stronger and stronger and stronger the more your shoes got wet and conditioned them once in a while with some kind of product, the same way that you put hand cream on your hands. And what happens is we moved away from that to the point because that insole is on the inside of your footwear that you never get to see. More often than not, almost always now, it's a compressed fiber board or paper. and that's going to deteriorate when it gets wet. So even though everything you see around that shoe is leather, in a pretty, probably a high-end shoe, the guts of it are not, and that's what makes it fall apart. So when we're working with veg tan leather, feel how different this is, the qualities of this are, when they're wet. So this is that leather when it's been mellowed. So I take that leather, I wet it for hours in a bucket, I wrap it in newspaper, and then I let it saturate overnight, and then then you can cut it like butter. Then you can push it all through it so easily. And you can't do that at all when you have it in that really hard state. So that's one primary material, is this hard veg tan leather, and that's how I'm working with it. And then the other is, it's called mineral tan or chrome tan. It's a different way of tanning leather that makes it like fabric, right? This doesn't have the same qualities at all of the veg tan leather. And this is the type of tannage that all of the upper part of our shoe is. And so this one here is a pig skin, which is pretty typical for cowboy work boots. So it's the size of the animal. So if I had a kid skin, it's going to be much smaller. If I had a cow skin, it could be absolutely giant. And most of the leather in our footwear was coming as a byproduct of the meat industry. So all these animals are being killed for meat, beef, mostly cows in the United States, and then that leather is being tanned and we're making shoes out of it. And tanning produces a lot of waste products that can be very, very damaging to the environment, to the workers in them. It doesn't have to be. When it's done responsibly, it's totally fine. But unless the companies were forced to be responsible, they usually weren't, which is why we had the super fun cleanups, and most of the tanneries, actually all the tanneries are gone from Massachusetts by now, but there are micro tanneries popping up again. Like this shift that I'm talking about, that I'm really excited for, is that there is a demand for responsible tanning in the United States. There's a micro tannery in the Hudson Valley. There are 2 that opened in Wisconsin in the last 5 years. And when it is done responsibly, it's great. And then you have high quality leather, and then you can have longer lasting shoes rather than shoes that fall apart within a year or so. So we start with those materials, those raw materials, the hard structural leather and the soft leather, and then we cut the pattern pieces out of them, which is called clicking. So this is a vamp. Remember my vamp building? Everybody knows now. That would be cut out of the hide and clicked. It would be clicked out of the hide. And the reason it's called clicking is because early on, all those women working in their homes, cutting out the pattern pieces, would make little templates so they could cut the same consistent size out over and over again. And those templates, if you cut against them with a knife, you damage the template. They put little bands of metal around them, and when you're cutting by hand with a knife, it makes a clicking noise against. So that's where the term clicking came from. When we graduated from, or evolved from doing it by hand to doing it by machines, the first thing, it looked like a big cookie cutter. They looked exactly like cookie cutters. We would hammer it, and it would cut the piece out. And so that was called a clicking knife. And then we moved to these big pneumatic machines that you push 2 buttons, and a huge press came down and cut those pieces out. And those are called clicking machines. And the workers on them in the factories were clickers. Now we do it with these laser cutting machines or these flash cut machines, which are digitally programmed, but they have a tiny little razor that goes around, and they're still called clickers, but that's where it's at. And the way that you click this out of the hide matters. Here's the spine down the middle, and all the stretch is going towards the stomach. And there's no stretch going this way. If you take any type of leather, go into where the knees and the kind of crooks of the skin were, it's going to be stretching in all directions. And so think of any kind of shoe, leather shoe you had, and you had the 2 shoes, and one wrinkled and bent weird across your foot, and the other didn't. And it had nothing to do with your foot, it had to do with what direction this guy clicked out. So early on, we had these knowledge sets of the best way to control how you wanted this leather to respond on the foot. And now we just do it in order to maximize production out of the hide. Another thing that we did to speed things up is we eliminated crimping. So crimping is taking a does a few things. One is it takes the stretch out across. This is going to sit across a foot this way. And then you think of shoes as needing a break-in period, or they, as they mold to your foot a little bit with wear, they're going to get looser, and that's mainly because they weren't crimped, right? All this stretch, there's still going to be stretch across here. And if you took that leather and stretched it, wet it, soaked it, stretched it on wooden forms, pulling it, nailing it, pulling it, nailing it, and then let that sit and dry. You've turned this 2D piece into a 3-dimensional piece. It doesn't lay flat anymore. And when it sits on this last, there's already, I'm not pulling with any might at all against here. You've eliminated that you have a higher quality final product. And that's one of the things we eliminated. And these 10-footers have so many of these crimping boards in their collections. And it looks like, a big sock. I feel like sometimes when you knit socks, you put in a little board to keep the shape. But they really were critical in all these reasons. Like, we had so many knowledge sets that just slowly got eliminated over time and affect the quality of the things we wear. So crimping is one of them. So here we have clicking the pieces out, crimping the pieces, and then we start stitching all the parts together. And in Western boots were the first boots in the human story that were lined, believe it or not. This is 1870s, and we had boot-making traditions coming from Spain, coming from mixing with indigenous practices in South America and Central America. We had all these vaqueros, horse riding culture. We had German influx into the middle of the country of all these German boot makers bringing their knowledge sets. And this boot developed, and it was lined, and we didn't have glues that were strong enough to hold lining to the front, to the back. So we stitched it, and that's how that cowboy boot fern stitch pattern started to come. And those early patterns, like a Kansas plant, look different than an Amarillo, Texas plant. So you could also place where boots were made by these stitch patterns, so that you could pass them from person to person. And this is one of the things that I absolutely fell in love with boot making, was that every single design decision on a relatively outrageous looking piece of footwear is rooted in function and what came about for being a tool. And then you have the possibility for this and potential for these beautiful things that are meaningful to people. So when I make my cowboy boots, I stitch all of these pieces flat on a sewing machine. Here I've taken my print band and stitched it to that top panel on the front. Here is the back panel that's going to go around the back of my foot. And it has that hard structural edge band leather. That's the counter, it's called. That's the part that cups your foot. If you have sneakers, you have a counter in there. That's probably synthetic, but shoes have a counter that pulls it all together. And then I move away from the machines, and I stitch my side seams by hand. So when I said I make Western side seam construction footwear, that's what I meant. You have 2 long side welts, and I stitch all this by hand. And then you have to turn it right side out. And voila, you've got your outfit. And so here, this part is ready for the making stage. This is when I start the making stage, when I have my outfits. And the very first thing that we start with making is a last. So a last is the form around which shoes are made. Your sneakers are made on last, and they look like a sneaker. High heel shoes, tiny strappy sandals are made on a last. This is the negative space inside, and it's not just a foot. If I cast your foot and made a shoe around it, it wouldn't work. This is a foot in motion. So we take all this information from a foot and build up volume in certain areas, make it tighter in other areas in order for this to work properly. And that in itself is an almost obsolete knowledge set. There's so few last makers who really know what they're doing. And all of us shoe and boot makers do the best we can, and some are better than others, but you really we need a dedicated last maker. But in Massachusetts, we had the first left and rights. This was the first here. All shoes, Western European style shoes, not indigenous shoes, were made on straight lasts. So this was called a straight. This would have been typical of all shoes and boots for up until even the Civil War boots were straights. So you just had a boot, and then you put it on and you wore it until it felt like it was a left or a right, and then kept track of which was which. And it would mold to your foot, and it would, start feeling better one way or the other. But the very first left and rights used were, that is documented, were in 1822 in Lynn. Daniel Silsby, and there's a Silsby Street with a Silsby everything there, but he would work out of a kitchen on Chestnut Street with left and right lasts, and they called them crookeds for a good decade. So you had straights and you had crookeds. In Western bootmaking, because that silhouette, this is clearly a cowboy boot last, right? It's got the pointy toe and the narrow waist and the high heel. This, we adapt lasts, so we're not carving lasts from scratch out of wood the way many shoemakers do, because we have this iconography, we have this silhouette that is really distinct. So we take old lasts and then adapt them, which means adding on. And here, I've added on leather here to make that toe a little wider. So when I make boots for people, I take a whole lot of information from their feet and then set up my last to reflect their feet. And that's how you make bespoke shoes or bespoke boots to certain people's feet. So I am making a boot for those 2 feet with a singular design for that person. And that's the part of my practice doing client work that it's the easiest to explain to people.
So Sarah, you have a last like that you've made for someone. Now the next person comes.
I keep it forever. I start with a new set of lasts for somebody else.
You start with some.
I have David Erickson's last hanging in my shop, and they say David on them. So
That's
I'll
right.
never touch them. So that's
He
how
has
it
some
works.
things in his
In
place.
this case, this last would have been in that cock loft in the 10-footers too. They take up space. Shoe factories had last rooms because they take up so much space. So
But they were saving for a customer?
no, because you need it for every shoe you're going to make. So every size, every half size, you have the left and the right. Every heel height, you can change your heel height. So if you're making, say, a run of women's high heel shoes, and you have one that's a half-inch lower, you need a totally different last, because all the volumes will shift when you change the heel height. So the things that can't change on a last are left and right, and the heel height. But all the other things can change. The toe shape should be totally aesthetic. So if this is done well, and you know where certain bones in the foot are, and you start that taper in advance of those bones, a pointy-toed shoe would never hurt your foot. Why people associate pointy-toed high heel shoes or cowboy boots to be painful is because fashion dictated that shoes look better on feet when they were smaller, so they pulled this back too far back and started pinching the bones across your joint. And a whole generation of people have their toes like this. So that all goes back to the last. So when people say I have hard to fit feet, or like my feet are weird, no feet are weird. Everybody's feet are totally normal. It's the lasts that are doing a disservice to you. And that if you find a type of shoe or a boot brand that fits you well, it's because that last for that particular company happens to align to your foot's characteristics pretty well. And for most shoe designing, they aim to hit 40% of the feet at a certain size. And so that means 60% of people at that size are not going to fit that shoe. And it's because of the last. And now these decisions are being dictated by fashion, completely, 100%.
So was last making a trade all
Yes.
of its own,
Yes.
just like a pattern maker
Yep.
was the stove maker?
Yep, yep.
A skilled woodworker
Yes.
and a sculptor, he's almost a sculptor and an artist in himself.
There's only 2 companies that are dedicated glass making companies left in both of them. They're really good glass makers in the orthopedic world because they study feet so much more, but they still are within the orthopedic footwear world. They're not just glass making for people. So when you take that glass, I would have, that mushy, nice yellow leather that you all just touched, I would have taken the leather and in that state and nailed it all the way around my last, like this. So if you look, I have this cut in half, this demo piece, and I have a lot of overhang because as it dries, it's going to shrink. And then when it's all dry, I pop those nails out and I carve with my knife and make it shaped and nice extension of the bottom of the last. And then I create with my knife and my awl this hold fast. And this is what I'm going to stitch everything together with. You can see this awl, if I push it through, there are those holes. I've pre-punched those holes so that when I go to sew everything together, it's not like fabric where you literally it's piercing the material. You have holes already and you're just guiding some of the thread through. And to make any pair of shoes or boots, you need 4 tools only. You need a hammer, that awl, a knife, and a lasting pincer, which is the shoemaker's main tool. So it's a plier that grabs the leather, and it's got this hammer onto it, either part of it. And what it does, this is a critical, probably, you know, there's a lot of hard processes in boot making and shoemaking, but this is probably the hardest one. And it's taking that leather and using the hammer as leverage to stretch and pull this into place. And then when you hold it there, it's done. You put a nail in and hammer it down, so it becomes a hammer. So you have this one tool in your hand doing that. It is critical when you last, and that process is called lasting. When you last, to get this upper exactly where the designer intended for it to fit. If it's too low on the bottom, I can show you one of my first boots that is way too low, then that counter is not going to grab the heel. It's not going to function right. When you walk, your heel's going to come up like a clog, and it's just not going to work. If you have it tipped too far to the right or too far to the left, it's not going to sit right. And sometimes we now do this with machines. You put this, and this is what I learned in shoemaking school. You put it into the machine, it pneumatically pulls it all together. And sometimes the machines shift them to the side. So you buy a pair of shoes at Target, and one is like shifted weird to the side, and it never wears right. It's because that lasting machine it was in the wrong position at the time. So this was the final process to go from hand making to machine making. Right? We mechanized every single process. We had everything streamlined, sped up, fast, and the hand lasters could do 50 pairs in a day. So these guys were just hand lasting all day long, sitting here, and you really couldn't make more shoes because you were limited by the hand laster's ability to do that. A man named Jan Matzeliger in Lynn, who worked in a shoe factory, he was engineering minded, but he was not a professional engineer. He invented the lasting machine in 1872, and he patented it, and he did it in the barn of his friend's house in the back at night. And he took him 3 years, and they were throwing big money at inventors and engineers to make this machine because they wanted to make more. And he is the only one who came up with a successful version, and he patented it, and he died within a couple years of TB, still pretty poor. And he was a black man who was experiencing pretty bad racism, according to his own accounts. And Sidney Winslow bought all his patents and founded USMC on his patents. And so this is also a part of our legacy of what we're making. And the machines, the high-tech lasting machines that exist now, are still based on the principle of his patent. I still last my hand. And so I get this all together. And so I built this display here, and I'll stand up here and come up and ask questions. I built this to show a single boot going through each stage so that you can see this process. So here's the boot that I have lasted, and all of the nails are just holding it in place. And so it's been lasted into the proper position. And those nails are sort of like pins in dressmaking. As I start stitching and sewing, I pull the nails out. And so by the end, there are no nails left. They're all gone. It's all sewn together. And this is called a welted construction. And this is what makes it repairable. So I am stitching this long strip in, and that strip, that welt strip, becomes the means to which we attach the sole. And so when you wear your soles away, you can cut the stitches that are holding the sole to the welt, and then pull off the old sole, put a new one on, and re-stitch it into those holes. And you can do that over and over and over again. And there are different versions of welting techniques. I use a pretty standard Western boot making one. But as long as your upper is also good quality material, you could have the same pair of shoes or two pair of shoes for your whole life. And that is designed with intent to repair. And this is what all of our shoes used to be like, whether they were mass produced by machine or by hand. And now we pretty much only have handmade traditions and the cowboy boot, the equestrian boot tradition that kept that alive. And so when people talk again about like why it's strange that I'm a Massachusetts cowboy boot maker, this construction was typical to what was happening in Massachusetts back then. I'm able to answer a lot of questions about the development of cowboy boots to boot makers who came to it through their culture, just by sharing Massachusetts history about boot making. And it's just like it's a really awesome time to be a boot maker because Instagram, here we are doing something like it was 1870, and then you inject technology not to craft process, but to connect us to information, to connect us to other boot makers. And we no longer have the kind of craft atmosphere where you're guarding your secrets because your livelihood's going to be affected if you share them. But now we all support each other, and we're all like just really close and really amazing, and it's thanks to Instagram. So, pretty wild. I bought a $1,000 Belstaff boot off of eBay, not for $1,000, and I cut it apart. Because they are a mass-produced boot that are supposed to be really high-end, high quality, and if I looked at it up close, I see all the characteristics of the boots that I make. When I started pulling it apart, here this is the sole, and so here they have a little groove that shows that they had stitched the welts to the sole. They've got the two layers, so here's that welt strip and here's the sole. But when you rip it up, it's just a piece of leather that's stitched to nothing, and then it's glued down. And then that little channel, they just cut a channel. It's cut to nothing, so it actually compromises the integrity of that sole. So the lengths to which we go to replicate construction of integrity in contemporary shoes is pretty astonishing. This is the boot that I pulled that fiberboard insole out of. When I look down into the boot, it says Vero Coil, so it's in Italian. It's indicating that it's high quality because they wrote it in Italian. And it's actually just a piece of split leather that's glued on top of the fiberboard. Nothing is attached to it. And split means when you get any piece of leather, it's super thick. All of these leathers used to be super thick like this. This is how thick leather is. And we take this and we run it through these huge machines called splitters that will split the thickness. So you can buy any thickness leather you want down to really fine leather. And the one at the top grain, the full grain, is the highest quality because the fibers are the densest altogether. So it actually has to do with the quality of the material. And then the little layer beneath it is called the first split. And it's okay because it's still pretty dense, but it's not as good as the top. The second split underneath that, you can keep splitting them. You can split it into about 3 or 4 splits. It's worse because the fibers are starting to get wider as they get towards the bottom. The bottom split is the absolute garbage, and that's the type of leather that, like, if you bought a really cheap leather shoe, you can actually tear it, or you bend it once and it rips. This is a split, and I can just tell you if I can tear it and pull it apart. So, again, all these visual indicators of something of quality that we don't know how to, like, we just don't know anymore. It's nobody's fault as an individual, but I'm telling you now, so you know a little bit more than you did yesterday. When I make my heels, I stack them. So I cut out of that heavy veg tan leather all of the heel shapes, and I put them together, and I wooden peg them and paste them, and then I shape it like sculpture. And a lot of people just think that's wood. Right? So here's a stacked leather heel that I didn't dye, so you can see all the lifts. And this too is repairable, right? Like a lot of people will wear their shoes just by the way they walk on one side, but you can pull off the rubber cap and you can pull off the first or second lift and replace them, put them back on very easily over and over and over. These are ways that we can make our footwear long lasting if they're constructed that way. More often than not, like this Belstaff one, It's compressed masonite that was put together. Or if you glued a whole bunch of that leather together, and I'll bring this over, and slice it really thin, like this here, you get a plastic heel and it's glue that veneer around it to make it look like it was stacked leather. And you can't really replace it with a piece of plastic that's been wrapped. I look at a lot of those old tools because we can't get them now, right? It's a big investment to become a shoemaker, just not just in expensive materials. But while I could make a shoe with just these 4 tools, it's going to be a really crude shoe. I have 5 lasting pincers that I use on any given boot. One has a really pointy nose for the toe. One has a really wide mouth with a curved hammer called for doing the waist. Like the better, more specialized tools I have, the higher the quality of the thing that I can produce. And we can't just go out and buy shoemaker tools anymore. Yet, Massachusetts has historical societies with hundreds and hundreds of hand tools in the basements. And some of them, notably the Buttonwoods Museum in Haverhill, has had me go through and pull out, say, these are your 5 best tools, these are how they were used, and these 18 other copies you have, they've been helping me with this program to get those back in the hand of shoemakers now. And it's been pretty great and exciting to say, okay, we've held them in trust for 100 years, and now there are shoemakers who need them. So that when a lot of shoemaking tools comes up on eBay, the same 60 of us don't outbid each other. So that's been a pretty rewarding way of going through these things, and not just doing it in order to put them on the shelf and say this is how it was used, but to say, hey, we can pass these on to people that need them now. And again, Instagram has been awesome, because then those shoemakers and bootmakers use it, say this came from Haverhill, and this is how I'm using it, these are the shoes I'm making with it, and that helps the museum as well. A lot of the tools that I use are really old, so while I'm not trying to replicate an old practice, people figured this stuff out and figured it out well, and they work well. They still work well. They were tools that were made. So I use some things that are just like gold, which my students always find kind of wacky, and other things that are really specialized, like these irons, these sole irons. So when you are just about finished with the edge of the sole, right, it's still pretty rough. At this point, I would rub some wax on it and heat up my iron on my potbelly stove, and it has a profile, there's 2 on this side and 2 on this side, that could be exactly specific to that size. So I have probably like 20 irons that all have like a slightly different profile. I find the right one that I need, and then with heat and pressure and a little bit of water and wax, this will seal that edge of that leather, keeps water out of it, and makes it beautiful as well. And some of them have little, almost like a molding profile, so you can have different things. So the more tools you have, the higher quality product that you produce. So the last thing, and I have the guts and all these bits here, so if you're interested in that part, then come up and see, and I can talk about it. But the final part is the pulling of the last, right? You've built this boot all the way around the last. You have the last on the inside. Usually when I'm just building and somebody comes in and looks at them and they pick it up, they're like, oh my gosh, they're so heavy, but the last is inside. So these old-fashioned lasts have a cone. So the last have to come apart. So here, when you look at this up close, you see that little line there, that's the cone. So I just pulled the cone out, and I have a little clip. Because you have to relieve some of that pressure in order to get the last out. And all the last, so if your last was solid, like this old straight, you could only make certain footwear on it. You could make sort of like a ballet flat or a moccasin type thing. Or you could have to have laces, right? If you have laces, you could undo the laces and then pull it out. But all of the lasts, even the old ones, have this hole in it, which conveniently you can put the string and hang up because they do take up space. But really that hole was for this hook to go in. So I've already put my hook in, hooked it into that hole. My hook is attached to the belt. I'm going to stand on it. And then this is the part where you pull all the bits out. Yeah. left nail. Out comes the last. And then you have your boot. The final step, so this was a men's size 22 last. This was a man who had really big feet. So he had to have this last company make him his own special in order for him to have boots or shoes, because otherwise he couldn't have bought off the shelf, obviously. But all those wooden pegs that I was driving in, right now, where parts of the boot are held together with wooden pegs, little wooden nails, that will then hold all those layers of leather together. And you can look at factory boots, you know, you probably have some pegs here at the bottom. It might be yeah. So one of the ways of speeding it up is to put a metal plate on the glass, and then you can just hammer it in, and it hits the metal plate and turns, and then the wood glass, just because it's not going to expand. But when I drove all those in, all the points came into the glass, right? So now I pulled that out. I pulled the last out, and if I put my hand in here, there's going to be all these little bits of wood sticking up. So the final thing, besides the polish, is breaking those pegs. So we have different types of tools, and this is the one I was telling you about, the peg rasp. So you have these big tools that go in, and they have to have a long handle, and you script it, it's like a file, and it's breaking all those bits off. And the version that you had found, and that had a circular one here, which I've never seen one like that before. And that circular one is ingenious because you can get the heel right at the top here. I'm always struggling to get this.
That's why I got the gift.
So
It's back there.
and then that's it. You know, you dump out your sawdust, and there you go. And you don't have an insert, you don't have anything, because you want that vegetable tan leather against your foot to mold with your foot for the time, and that's how it's going to fit better and better. So these are all, I will invite you to come up, these are all boots that I've made. There's my display here of all the different stages. There's all the tools that I use and come up and touch, and there's nothing sharp except the awl. I'll stick the awl here. But please do. Any questions?
Yeah, how long does it take to make?
So this is the part that is the longest on many of the boots. So say it was a totally plain ground from the top, probably 60 hours from beginning to end. And because there is so much wetting and drying, you couldn't do it 60 hours beginning to end. It's stretched out over time. The fastest boots I ever made were 3 weeks, and I killed myself to do it. Usually I take about a year, but I have multiple boots going, and I just slowly go on and take the time I'm going to need. This stuff adds lots of time. The longest boots I've ever made were, I hand embroidered a lot at the top, were 180 hours. And that was back when I kept track. I don't keep track anymore. I have a good gauge of how long things will take me. So these ones here, I bought dyed at the factories. So I have a whole bunch of leathers that are all different colors. And if there is something that I want that I can't find, I can dye it myself. And then I would buy something called plus color. And it comes, the tannery is tanned to the point where they were going to dye it and they were going to seal it, and you don't, and they'll sell it to you that way. And then I have the right dyes and like waxes that would seal it. And for me personally, I only ever do that if I'm doing decorative work where I want variation, like flowers that are dark blue and lighter at the top. I don't do it that way. But some shoemakers make their whole shoe in crust and then color it. So they can really control it.
No, one of the things that weren't in your presentation that are the most indelible pair that I've seen of you work on ones with the exact knife blades.
Yeah,
Do you have a picture of those with you?
I do have a picture of them. So I made a pair of shoes that I embroidered 2,200 exact blades onto the shaft as one of my art pieces. They are at the Fuller Craft Museum this year. So if you want to see them in person, then go to Rockton, Massachusetts.
thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to have you here, and just love Julie for coming and doing refreshments for us, and for everyone at the Historical Society that just really gives so much to bring this kind of programming to the community. So really appreciate you all coming. If you have any questions for Sarah, she'll be here. And thank you.